Hello, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, how much should race, gender and ethnicity matter when you apply for a job or place at university? Our digital producer Malika Bilal is here looking out for your live feedback as always. Affirmative action is the subject. Is there any consensus with our online community?
Well, there were differing opinions on whether or not affirmative action is still necessary and whether or not we need it. But the consensus came on the original intent behind it. Skelly tweets, "The purpose of affirmative action is to attempt to heal the deep wounds of racism perpetuated by hundreds of years of discrimination." Now, for those of you at home, we want you to join in on the discussion. As always, use the hashtag AJStream.
So sitting in the studio between Malika and myself, we have Kendra Pettis. And Kendra is from racedelicious.com. That's a blog on race and pop culture. Kendra, it's good to have you in the stream.
Thank you for having me.
You'll be hearing even more from Kendra in just a moment. But right now, I have to tell you, this show is driven by your ideas. So if you have a pitch, follow us on Twitter at AJStream, share your story, and believe me, it could end up as a program on the air.
I'm Jimmy Israel, writer and journalist, and you're on the stream.
Are US affirmative action programs designed to help minorities holding white applicants back? Many people in the US think so and have been looking at the court case of Abigail Fisher, who says she didn't get a place at the University of Texas because she's white. She sued, claiming reverse discrimination. Have a listen to this.
There were people in my class with lower grades who weren't in all the activities I was in who were being accepted into UT, and the only other difference between us was the color of our skin.
Now, the university claims that Abigail Fisher didn't qualify for entry based on her grades, and after 5 years, her case made it all the way to the US Supreme Court, but was thrown back to an appeals court for review this week. Supporters of affirmative action say that it improves opportunities for minorities and is still necessary to increase diversity after years of discrimination. Critics argue the policies are outdated and are no longer necessary. But with the white population of the US projected to become a minority by 2050, does affirmative action still make sense? To help us explore this, we have on Skype Ari Berman. He's a contributing writer for The Nation. In our Google Plus Hangout, we have Jerome Hudson. Jerome is the spokesman of the National Leadership Network of Black Conservatives, known as Project 21. He's in Florida. Kristen Tate from Boston, and she blogs at the libertarianchick.com website. And finally, Yash Butada is a student at the University of Michigan and a blogger for Michigan Daily. It's good to have all of you in the stream. I'm going to start with Jerome, though. Jerome, when you heard about Abigail Fisher's case, what was your first reaction?
I was disappointed. It just reminded me of sort of the misalignment that comes along with affirmative action. I mean, that is one of the cases in which we see it's an unintended consequences. Those cases do happen. Specifically, I understand that the university said that her grades weren't sufficient. Nevertheless, affirmative action and racial preferences when it comes to the admission process puts blacks and other minorities in a separate class. And that in and of itself is discrimination. To base a person's admission on their ethnicity, and if you will, the color of their skin is discrimination. And again, you know, it's unfortunate, but that's what came to mind. I was disappointed.
Kendra?
Well, okay, I think that first we should remember that admissions, there's no set guideline for college admissions. There's no rubric that people are using, admissions officers are using. In fact, it's not just one person sitting in a room deciding on these kids. It's a group of people trying to decide who's going to get into this school. And it's based on not just the academic factors or the extracurricular factors, but what the group is looking like that year. The group of students is not homogeneous from year to year. And so they have to sort of decide what the group is looking like that year. And race is not the only card that plays into it. It's like a plus. It's not a quota. it's sort of a plus, like athletics would be a plus or an extracurricular would be a plus.
Kristen, are you laughing? Do I hear you chuckling there?
Yeah, I mean, I was too. I mean, I think it's absolutely offensive and condescending to assume that Black students need a hand up or a handout to compete with other races. I mean, I personally know from school several Black students that are far smarter than I and far more qualified than I. They certainly didn't need any affirmative action to get where they're at. You know, it may very well be that a lot of people look at these high-achieving minority students and assume that they got where they are, not because of how smart or talented that they actually are, but because they got a hand up from affirmative action, and that is just so not fair, and it's insulting.
Kristen, if I may, you're saying that they got a hand up. Online, people are saying it's not necessarily a hand up. It's about leveling the playing field. Norma says, in its broadest sense, affirmative action of some sort is essential to even up the playing field for non-white, non-rich worldwide. And Wise One on Twitter says, it's impossible to undo what slavery and racism has done. You can be honest and do what you can, or dishonest and claim you've done enough. So is what we're doing claiming that we've done enough?
Listen, I mean, there are tons of Black students who come from very affluent families. I think what you're talking about is not a race issue, it's a socioeconomic issue. If you want to talk about leveling the playing field, we can talk about socioeconomic issues. But when you're just talking about race and letting somebody in to a school based on the color of their skin, that is just extremely racist, and it only widens the race gap instead of promoting a race-blind, equal society.
So I think we need to also dispel the sort of myth that affirmative action is only working for Black students. Affirmative action does not only affect Black people. It affects white women like yourself. It affects Latinos, Asians, Native Americans who really need affirmative action because of what this country has done to them.
Affirmative action? That's just insulting.
It's not insulting. It's just
you're sending the message to young students that they cannot do something on their own. You're telling young Black students, young young Indian students, you can't get into this school on your own.
No, what I'm doing.
Actually, Kristen, you mentioned a young Indian student, so that really, Yash, hello. We need to hear from you.
Yeah,
Jerome, we'll come back. Yeah. But Yash, go for it.
For me, I guess kind of what happened is, I mean, I was born in India, I came to the United States, and I grew up in a predominantly white community. And, you know, like throughout my entire life, I was definitely struggling to figure out what kind of identity I wanted to have, where I belonged socially. And it was only in college where I really found the platform for myself. And the thing is, a lot of minority students, this isn't just a unique situation for me. This is what a lot of minority students internally struggle with on a daily basis. And so many of them haven't had parents who've gone to school in the United States, haven't had parents who actually have even had higher education, and that's something that is attributed to race, and that's something that's been going on because of the past 200 years of history. A lot of these parents don't have that experience, and so these students don't have the same resources that maybe a privileged person might have.
Jerome?
No, I'm sorry, I do not know your panelist. I can't remember her name, but she said that race is a...
You'll know the name by the end of the discussion, believe me.
I'm sure I will. Kendra said, and that is true, but I disagree. I think that race should have nothing to do with the admission standard, but she made the argument that it's a plus. And I disagree. I think that it puts minorities in a separate class. This is segregation. This is discrimination.
Okay.
And it fosters a message to minorities that normal standards do not apply, and so they need to be lowered. I mean, that to me sends a demoralizing message that actually, reinforces the same sin that affirmative action says it argues against. All right,
let me just leave a little bit of space for Ari to come into the conversation. Ari, jump in.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Jerome is making the same argument that Clarence Thomas made
in
his dissent in the affirmative action.
Jerome, we've heard you sort of set out your stall for a moment. Just give Ari some space. And Ari, we have an international audience, so just fill us in on Clarence Thomas so everybody around the world gets who he is.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, very conservative member of the court. He made the argument that basically increased racial diversity, which is what you get from affirmative action, equals segregation. I think that's a very, very radical argument that certainly is out of step particularly with how African Americans feel about affirmative action. But there's a larger legal theory here, I think, that's being challenged in this case, which is the idea that any efforts to address historic discrimination, any efforts that try to level the playing field, that consider race as one of many options, is in and of itself discriminatory. Now, this is an idea that didn't have much ideological credibility in the Supreme Courts of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But what we've seen is a push to put more and more very conservative people on the court who believe that we've basically are done dealing with discrimination, that those days are over, and that anything that tries to address discrimination is on its face discriminatory. The problem with that is the facts of the case in Texas. You look at Texas, it's a state where blacks and Hispanics are much more likely to live below the poverty line than whites. That's just a fact. It's not an opinion. It's just something that we know from the data. We also know that Texas, by using race as one factor in admissions, not the only factor,
right,
one factor in admissions, had the 6th most diverse student body in the country. So clearly affirmative action was working at Texas. If the goal was a more diverse student body, then using race as one factor made it a possibility. Now, if you believe that there shouldn't be that level of diversity at the University of Texas, then you should be against affirmative action. But if your goal is to have more diversity, the program was clearly working.
All right.
Listen, can I jump in here for a second? When you say diversity, what do you mean? Do you mean checking off boxes with different races and meeting quotas? Or do you mean, I mean, how do you measure diversity? Because as a very recent student, I measure diversity by character, talent, and life experiences. I don't measure it by how many black students, how many white students are in a school. That's not necessarily diversity. You can have a lot of black students at a school that all came from middle-class families that won't necessarily contribute the same diverse qualities that, you know, a white student from a lower class neighborhood outside of New York might contribute. I don't think this is a race. I don't think diversity is correlated to race necessarily.
All right, so we're going to answer that, but I need to just get the community in, because the community is saying, can I jump in a second? Absolutely, community, go for it.
They are, and actually there's a tweet here of someone that agrees with you, Kristen. Grantley White says, whatever happened to winning places on merit and not patronizing? But Yash, I want to bring this one to you, because in your piece on Policy Mike that I pulled up on my screen here, Supreme Court affirmative action, why we still need it today, I've highlighted this section. You say, unfortunately, the very conception of performance is often framed by privilege. And I think that relates really nicely with that tweet we just read about merit versus patronizing. Talk to us about privilege and who has it.
Yeah, definitely. So something that's really interesting about this is we keep on talking about how we need to pick the most successful people. And when you're analyzing success, you follow the straight scale. And so the thing is, though, when you're comparing a minority student who is dealing with identity issues on a daily basis, dealing with racial injustices daily, is trying to reconcile the fact that their parents didn't go to college or their parents aren't from the United States, and dealing with all those issues, and suppose that person gets a 26 on their ACT. That person, to me, would be much more impressive than someone who did have all of those things, didn't have to deal with any of those kinds of barriers, and got a 30 on their ACT.
So Yash,
the level of success, I think, needs to be taken into context.
Yash, what do you make of Kristen being insulted on your behalf?
Insulted on my behalf? Well, the thing is, I mean, some racial injustice has been something that's gone on for about 200 years, and the thing is, a lot of these families don't have a line of generations of people who have gone to college or have those kinds of resources. And another thing is that, you know, once again, you have to measure success in terms of context. And it's not a thing of, oh, because you're a minority, that makes you better. It's more of a thing that, given your circumstances, you've had X, Y, and Z experiences, and because of those experiences, you have been able to be successful.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I grew up in a little suburb outside of New York called Maplewood, New Jersey, and we had great public school system. I cannot say anything bad about it. I did transfer out. I ended up going to a boarding school in New England. But the public school system that I was in, the guidance counselors, they were amazing. They would have got me into college. They would have done what they needed to do. to make sure that I was going to succeed. However, I deal now with inner city school guidance counselors. I deal with kids, minority kids mainly in the Bronx, in Queens, in Brooklyn, those areas. And I get guidance counselors on the phone who literally will tell me they are more concerned with their tenure and how losing their high performance children to better schools, better programs, and the public school system, how that's going to look when it comes time to review whether they're getting tenure or not. So that's what minority kids are dealing with on a daily basis in inner city schools, places like New York, places like Chicago, where they're closing public schools that have minority populations. So that's one of the main reasons why we still need affirmative action.
Jerome?
No, I'm still a little bit confused on this idea of diversity. It seems to be concentrated on actually getting students of color into the schools. And yes, Texas may have more diverse campuses, but the failure and dropout rates have skyrocketed across the country in schools that still rely on race as a factor of admission. These kids, scores of them, need to be in remediation in their first year. And so, I get that we want to have our college campuses be reflective of the rest of the country, but that to me it makes unfair assumptions to think that if we have just enough Latinos and blacks that there's going to be quote unquote diversity. My understanding of college, it is supposed to be intellectually rigorous, in that diversity should not be diversity of skin color, but diversity of thought across the student body.
Okay.
And again,
okay, but are those dropout rates and those non-graduation rates, are those because those kids don't deserve to be there, or is it because they're getting onto the campus and they're having to deal with incidents like what happened at Oberlin, at Oberlin College in Ohio, where they found someone in a KKK robe running around campus? Are the kids getting there, and they're in these diverse communities, are they getting the support that they need? Do they have Africana groups? Are there places like Casa Hispanica, like on Oberlin campus? Are there groups that are, and sort of things that are being put in place so that these kids are then comfortable on the campuses? Because you're right, it's not just enough to get them there. They have to have then the support system on campus that's going to enable them to succeed, because like Yash was saying, a lot of these are first generation college students.
Okay, Malika.
Oh, those are great points. And I feel like we're in the trenches now. And Ari, I want you to bring us out of it and give us a more broader view. High Contrast on Twitter says, affirmative action is reverse discrimination, but it's necessary in order to correct the uneven distribution of money across race in America. Will we ever see a time, Ari, when it's not necessary, as this person on Twitter says, 20 years' time, when the majority is the minority?
It's certainly possible. I mean, we're in a situation right now where, for example, the black unemployment rate is almost twice as high as the white unemployment rate. And so there's a lot of challenges in terms of socioeconomics. And I think diversity has to represent both class and racial backgrounds. It has to represent both. But if you look at what's happening here, I mean, basically, people are making the argument that programs that have been intended to rectify historic instances of discrimination, essentially, once they succeed, are victims of their own success. And we saw this not only with affirmative action, but challenging other policies like the Voting Rights Act. And so I think what's going on here is there has been this long movement to try to get rid of policies like affirmative action. It happened, for example, in the 60s, and it's picked up steam in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And we now have a determined attempt, for example, to bring these cases. The person who brought the case, the Abigail Fisher case in Texas, her father was a very good friend of a man by the name of Ed Bloom, who runs a place called the Project on Fair Representation. It's a conservative legal defense firm, and its sole job is to find these cases, to find the plaintiffs, to pay for the lawyers, and to get them before the Supreme Court. So there's not necessarily a need to hear these cases right now. Right. There's just a determined effort to get the cases before the courts, to rule on them, even if they're working. This current Supreme Court kind of punted on its decision. It sent it back to the University of Texas and said, you need to apply a stricter standard in terms of how you deal with affirmative action. You have to make sure that you've exhausted every possible avenue before you treat race as one of many considerations. Now, it's unclear if Texas is going to be able to meet that standard, but certainly if they're not able to, I think it will have very large ripple effects throughout the country, particularly because the Supreme Court upheld affirmative action at the University of Michigan Law School as recently as 2003. So this would be a very major shift in terms of the law.
Ari, I'm just going to throw this back to Kristen. Kristen, we're in the last tiny little bit of the program, so I'm just going to ask you this quick question. You can give me a quick response. In 20 years' time, you are going to be a minority in America. We could be having this exact same conversation, and poor little Kristen here, you're in the minority, and people are trying to get your kids into school with affirmative action. Would you still be against it?
Of course I would, because affirmative action is inherently racist. It's giving benefits based on race instead of merit. Now, diversity, there's definitely something to be said for diversity on campuses. But again, I don't think diversity is just about race. Diversity has to do with a number of things. Socioeconomic factors, experiences, unique experiences that you can bring to the campus. And again, I just want to reiterate that I would be offended that society would tell my children, minority children, that they need, a leg up, that they can't make it on their own. So of course I would still be against
Christine
it.
is sticking to her point. This conversation is not done yet. If you want to tune into more of it, go to stream.aljazeera.com. But right now, here's Malika with some of the other stories we're following on the stream.
A nationwide strike by teachers in Kenya has some netizens saying it's time to listen to their demands. The hashtag #WhyTeachers started trending after teachers took to the streets for a second day over low pay and allowances. Chito tweets, "Why teachers should be heard. They are teaching future presidents, and the longer we keep them from class, we delay future country development." Faith adds, being a child of a teacher, her medical allowance can't even pay for the transport to the hospital. Well, caught in the gridlock between the government and teachers' union are students who've been left out of classrooms. One student sums up the sentiment in this clip from NTV Kenya.
We're not going to learn more because we expected the teachers to teach us, and that's all. We are going to stay at home until we heard what the government will say.
Our next leads from the U.S., where two landmark decisions by the Supreme Court have supporters of marriage equality celebrating. Large crowds waited outside the Supreme Court to hear that the Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA, which deprived gay couples of federal marriage benefits, is unconstitutional. The court also cleared the way for same-sex marriage in California. Well, President Obama immediately showed his support by tweeting, "Today's DOMA ruling is a historic step forward for marriage equality. #Love is love." His message was retweeted more than 60,000 times, and the phrase "love is love" became the top trending hashtag in the U.S. Brian tweets, "Equality is inevitable. Good job, Supreme Court, on voting down DOMA and Prop 8. But some lamented the ruling, with one Catholic group vowing to continue the fight to define marriage as between a man and a woman. What do you think of the decision? Go to facebook.com/AJStream and tell us in the comments. Femi?
What do you think of the decision, Kendra?
I'm thrilled about it. I wish that it had been sort of a federal with Prop 8, a federal oversweeping, legalizing marriage. But I'm very glad for it, and I wish that the Voters' Rights Act had gone the same way.
Oh, she's very versatile. She has an opinion about everything. That's what you need to do if you work for racialicious.com. Now, what are we doing on tomorrow's program? Well, on the next show, you read all of the terms and conditions before hitting I agree when you're online. If you do, we're actually signing off on big tech companies mining our data. But what can we do to protect our privacy? Yes, that old chestnut. We will find out in tomorrow's discussion. Stay with us. The post show is next at stream.aljazeera.com, so you know where you're going to find us. We'll be online. Thanks for watching. Did you miss us? Yes, we went away for a couple of seconds. Welcome back. It's the Stream's online post show. We are talking about affirmative action and if it's still necessary. Joining me is Kendra Pettis from Racialicious, Ari Berman from The Nation, Jerome Hudson from Project 21. Kristen Tate is a libertarian blogger and Yush Butada is a University of Michigan student and blogger. So, we definitely have an issue about some students not getting access to university, whether you decide it's race or background or socioeconomic background. So, Jerome, if we get rid of affirmative action, how do we make sure that students who really should be part of the diverse mix get into that mix? What else is there?
I think this pretty much goes to the root cause that a lot of times gets left out of this conversation, and it's academic rigor in specifically Black and Latino homes. I mean, scores of studies have found that Black and Hispanic kids watch way more TV than white kids do. They read less, and the testing scores are pretty persistent as well. And again, this is a root cause issue. This is also a cultural issue as well. Leaving race aside from it, there are a lot of Black, specifically kids, who grow up in single-parent homes. And without a second parent in the house, it is a lot harder for that single parent to focus on the child's academics. And that actually transcends until the time that they do fill out the application when they're trying to get into college.
All right, so you've just called out the obvious. Now what? What next? What do we do with that? If we're not
well, I think the conversation should shift heavily on concentrating on that. What is wrong? Our public school systems need to be reformed. I think instead of concentrating so much on these tangential social issues like safe sex and gender identity, we actually need to focus on mathematics and literature and critical thinking. I mean, those other things, those street smarts, if you will, they're important too, but what we are seeing time and time again for minorities, Blacks and Hispanics, if that is the focus of this conversation, they are testing lower, they are graduating college, needing to be in remedial classes by the time they get to campus, and we're not really doing a disservice. And I think it just compounds the problem when you actually communicate to them a message that says that their race help them get to this campus. That is a message of inferiority.
Well, Kendra, I want to pose the same question that Femi just asked to you, also looking at this Facebook comment, taking this into mind. Kayla says, it's not the whole recipe for absolute equality, meaning affirmative action, but it's a vital ingredient on the way there. Those people who think racism is wiped out in the States need a reality check. We've come a long way, it's true, but we have a lot longer to go. So the court this time took it back to another court. But let's say, in the near future, if it is overturned, what is the alternative?
Well, first of all, I hate that we're demonizing single parents. I feel like that happens a lot. I don't think it's fair. By saying that a lot of people coming out of single family homes are performing lower. I think that's hard. We shouldn't be sort of jumping on them to make the blame for that. But if affirmative action was overturned, I agree. We do need to reform our public schools. Our kids could be performing a lot better. We should not, however, be going straight to looking for standardized test scores to show aptitude. Standardized test scores are not the be-all and end-all of showing how smart a kid is. There are different kinds of intelligences, and I really think that we need to focus on that. We need more programs that get kids involved in the extracurriculars that their sort of privileged counterparts are involved in. I work with a great group, figure skating in Harlem. We have a bunch of little Black girls and Latina girls who figure skate, and they do it for free, and that's going to be a thing that really helps them when it comes to either applying to private high school or applying to private or state colleges. So I think it's stuff like that we really, really need to work on if we came into a point where race could no longer be considered.
Ari, where are we going to next in terms of framing this affirmative action debate? There's obviously still a lot of heat in it. We're not over and done with this yet. If you had to predict what would happen next, what would you say?
Well, yeah, it's always surprising me, given our country's history, how controversial affirmative action is. I mean, it seems to me as something that's relatively common sense given our history, but it remains something that people get very riled up about. I think we're going to see more court battles like this. We're going to see, as we become more of a majority-minority country, we're going to see more battles over race and representation, whether it's in schools or whether it's in voting or other aspects of society, until we, I think, come to peace with this diversity. And there are going to be people who don't like the diversity, who want to call it other things, who want to call the whole notion of trying to foster diversity racist in and of itself. And there's going to be a whole nother school of thought of people who embrace it. And I think ultimately the people who embrace the demographic change are going to be the most successful, because the demographics are changing. And so the courts can forestall some of that progress. There's no doubt about it. The courts can get rid of things like affirmative action. The courts can get rid of things like the Voting Rights Act. But ultimately they can't stop the demographic change that's occurring. And so I think there's going to be some sort of tension between the law and how it's interpreted and just the raw facts of demographics in America.
Yash, you're incredibly talented and you're doing really well at university right now, and you've really been one of our biggest proponents of actually how affirmative action is working. If you're feeling all this heat in the discussion just in this conversation, do you think it could still exist beyond the next couple of years or so?
Oh yeah, most definitely. I definitely think the affirmative action debate is nowhere near close to done. I think what a lot of universities are trying to do now, this is actually something I wanted to add to what Kendra was saying before, is for those universities such as the University of Michigan that banned affirmative action through the proposal a few years ago, the universities like that need to start enhancing its recruitment process and really reaching out to low-income communities, minority communities, and really trying to push those extracurriculars, just like Kendra was saying, and really help give them the resources early on. So I know we've been talking a lot about how there's this big issue in public education, and yeah, I think all of us can agree that that is there, but the thing is we can't just stop affirmative action while we wait for public education to get fixed. We need to have something in place, and I think all affirmative action proponents also agree that it isn't a solution to everything. It's something there to remedy some of the consequences of 200 years of racial history. So there's a lot of work to be done still, and there's a lot that universities need to do as well.
Yash, you were talking about extracurricular activities, and I had to Google figure skating in Harlem. Look what I found on my laptop. Kendra, talk us through this fantastic picture. What is going on here?
That would be our synchronized
Black girls
skating team.
skating?
Yes.
I thought I was the only one who could skate.
No, yeah, that's our synchronized skating team, and I don't know what competition that would be at, but yeah, we compete. They went to Easterns this year. It was great.
And explain how, because people outside of the US may not understand, there's when you go and apply for university, not only do you have to have good grades, there's an essay going on here. You have to be, like a high jumping, figure skating, amazing person.
People think that when you're applying to any school, they're just looking at grades and then sort of basic extracurriculars and then apparently race. They think that those are sort of the three things that get you into school. That's not the case at all. You can be a 4.3 GPA student with every extracurricular activity on the book and stellar essays, and then you go in for the interview and you're just a horrible person. Okay. I can tell you. I mean, I do alumni interviewing for Oberlin, and I interview at my current job for our kids, and if that kid can be perfect on paper and then you just meet them and you're like, this kid is not going to add positively to my school environment. Right. And I would then take the kid who was slightly maybe less accomplished
and send them figure skating.
Yeah.
All right, and that is the end of our conversation. Apart from Malika Bilal, what's the community saying?
I'll give us a nice little tease. This one's from Cherie. She says, it's funny that people complain about affirmative action when, aside from university, minorities don't get an advantage. She says race is inherently unequal.
So I have to say thank you to Kendra, to Yash, to Ari, to Jerome and Kristen. Thank you for the conversation. You gave us a workout here on the stream. We really appreciate it. So about the next show. Now, when you're online, do you read all the terms and conditions before you hit I agree? Well, we are actually signing off on the big tech companies that are mining our data. But what can we do to protect our privacy? We'll be talking about that in the next show. Until then, see you online. Take care.